In the early 1930s, the American dream didn't just fade. It curdled into a nightmare for millions. The Great Depression had transformed the land of opportunity into a grim landscape of breadlines, soup kitchens, and broken spirits. While the average citizen struggled to find a single nickel for a cup of coffee, a new kind of aristocracy was taking shape in the shadows of urban tenements and the smoke-filled backrooms of speakeasies. These men didn't fear the stock market crash. They thrived on it. They didn't wait for government relief. They seized what they wanted at the end of a Thompson submachine gun. This was the era of the silk tie and the fedora, where the violin case often held a Chicago typewriter instead of an instrument. This decade would transform disparate ethnic street gangs into a sophisticated corporate conglomerate of crime that would eventually hold the entire United States in its grip. To understand the 1930s Mafia, you must first look at the wreckage of the old world. Before the Syndicate existed, the underworld was governed by the Mustache Petes, older Sicilian immigrants who lived by the archaic, bloody codes of the Omerta and the Vendetta. Men like Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano were feudal lords, more interested in ancient blood feuds from the hills of Sicily than in the modern logistics of a national business. Joe Masuria, based in East Harlem, was a traditionalist who demanded absolute fealty and often ignited wars over trivial slights. His rival, Salvatore Maranzano, was a classically educated man who quoted Roman emperors but ruled with the same medieval brutality. By 1930, their rivalry erupted into the Castellammarese War, named after Maranzano's birthplace in Sicily. This wasn't a tactical war. It was a meat grinder. From February 1930 to April 1931, the streets of New York became a shooting gallery. Key figures were picked off one by one. Gaetano Reina was gunned down in February, followed by the legendary Giuseppe Morello in August. Joe Aiello was riddled with bullets in Chicago as part of the cross-country carnage. For the younger generation of mobsters, men born in the US or who had immigrated as children, this war was a monumental waste of money and a beacon for unwanted police attention. Charles Lucky Luciano was the visionary among these young Turks. While the old bosses were fighting over honor, Luciano was looking at the ledgers. He realized that the only way for the mob to survive was to stop the internal bleeding. Luciano, along with his Jewish counterpart Meyer Lansky, understood that crime was a business, not a crusade. In April 1931, Luciano orchestrated the ultimate betrayal. He lured his own boss, Joe Masuria, to the Nuova Villa Tomorrow restaurant in Coney Island for a long seafood lunch. Luciano famously excused himself to the bathroom, and seconds later, gunmen, including Bugsy Siegel and Vito Genovese, burst in. Masuria was found dead on the floor, allegedly clutching the ace of spades. With Masuria gone, Maranzano briefly reigned as Capo di Tutti I Capi. He plotted to kill Luciano and Genovese, but Luciano struck first. On September 10, 1931, four men posing as tax agents entered Maranzano's Midtown office. They stabbed and shot him to death while his bodyguard stood by, neutralized. The old world of the Mustache Pete was officially dead. In its place, Luciano built the Commission. This was the most significant moment in the history of organized crime. Instead of one dictator, there would be a board of directors. The Commission consisted of the heads of the 5 families of New York: Luciano, Mangano, Gagliano, Prophesy, and Bonanno, along with representatives from Chicago and Buffalo. They treated crime like a Fortune 500 company, dividing the country into territories and fixing the prices of bootleg liquor. Luciano's philosophy was simple. Cooperation was more profitable than conflict. While Luciano was the architect in the East, the Midwest was dominated by the most famous face of the era, Al Capone. Known as Scarface, Capone was the antithesis of Luciano's low-profile approach. He was a media darling who gave press interviews and opened soup kitchens to buy public loyalty. He lived like a king in the Lexington Hotel, but his flamboyance was his undoing. He became public enemy number 1, forcing the federal government to innovate. Since they couldn't pin his murders on him, they used the IRS. In 1931, investigator Frank Wilson and his T-men meticulously combed through ledgers from Capone's gambling houses, like the Ship in Cicero. Armed with evidence of a massive untaxed income, the government secured an 11-year prison sentence. Capone was sent to Alcatraz, proving that even a king could be brought down by a bookkeeper's pen. With the commission running the business, the mob needed an enforcement arm to ensure the board's rules were followed. They created Murder Incorporated, a cross-ethnic hit squad based out of Rosie Gold's 24-hour candy store in Brownsville, Brooklyn. Led by Louis Lepka Buckleter and Albert, the Lord High Executioner Anastasia, this group turned assassination into a bureaucratic process. They didn't kill for personal reasons. They killed because a contract had been approved. The most prolific killer, Harry Strauss, was credited with over 100 murders. They used ice picks, sash cords, and meat cleavers, often disposing of bodies in the foundation of New York's rising skyscrapers. This era proved the mafia had evolved. They had a dedicated human resources department for murder, keeping the bosses insulated and the soldiers busy. The year 1933 brought the biggest economic shock the Syndicate had ever faced: the repeal of Prohibition. On December 5th, the easy money from illegal alcohol vanished. A lesser organization would have crumbled, but the 1930s Mafia was built for adaptability. They pivoted almost instantly into labor racketeering, narcotics, and gambling. They realized that the real power wasn't in selling beer, but in controlling the unions. By infiltrating the longshoremen, the Teamsters, and the garment workers' unions, the mafia became an invisible tax on every product moved in the United States. The mob even set its sights on Hollywood. Using corrupt union leaders like Willie Byoff and George Brown, the Chicago outfit extorted millions of dollars from major movie studios like Paramount and MGM. They threatened mass work stoppages unless paid off personally in cash. The mafia essentially held the American film industry hostage, forcing studio heads to pay a protection tax just to keep the cameras rolling. By the end of the decade, the law was finally catching up. Thomas E. Dewey, an ambitious special prosecutor, began dismantling the structures Luciano had built. However, Dewey had an unlikely and brilliant hero on his team, Eunice Hunton Carter. As the only woman and person of color on the 20 Against the Underworld team, Carter was the one who noticed that every time a prostitution house was raided, the same lawyers and bondsmen appeared. She methodically linked New York's brothels to the mafia's combination. Her work led to the 1936 trial of the century, where star witness Cokie Flo Brown helped secure a 30 to 50-year sentence for Lucky Luciano. As the world stood on the brink of World War II, the American mafia had completed its transformation. It was no longer a collection of immigrant gangs. It was a shadow government. The 1930s had provided the perfect environment, a mix of economic desperation, political corruption, and technological advancement for the mob to perfect its craft. The decade started with blood on the cobblestones of Little Italy and ended with the mafia controlling the docks, the construction sites, and the political machines of America's greatest cities. The kingpins had learned that in America, you don't just commit crimes. You own the system that allows them to happen. The reign of the Syndicate had truly begun, and it would take another 50 years for the government to even begin to tear it down.